Namaskaram, and Xin Chào from Hanoi, Vietnam. My name is Eliza Keyton, and I'm very excited to be a part of this year's Polyglot Conference. I'm a teacher of English as an additional language for more than a decade, and I've worked in places like South Korea, the UAE, and now Vietnam. However, in my free time, I create learning resources for the Dravidian language of Malayalam. It's spoken by over 40 million native speakers in Kerala and its diaspora. However, until I started learning it 3 years ago, I had found that there weren't many resources for non-native speakers to learn from. So I took to Instagram and started a studygram, and after it became extremely popular, I learned about the reach and strength that is in social media and have since become a proponent of creating educational materials through social media and empowering communities through their own narratives. So I'm glad that you joined me today, and I can tell you much more about the wonderful use of social media and education. Swagada. Now, this talk will first go over how we traditionally learn languages, the sources of our language input, and what are the traditional ways that we've come to know our first and second and many other languages that we choose to study. But then we'll also look into their shortcomings and dive in a little deeper on why these shortcomings exist and how it affects lesser spoken languages. And then we'll look into the reasons why social media is a credible and valuable resource for learning languages. And I'd like to wrap up by showing some successful, active, robust programs that are using social media and technology to preserve language and traditions. So let's get started. When we think about how we learn a language, there are many traditional ways in which we learn. So let's think about that for a minute. How did we learn our first language? How did we learn our additional languages? And what approaches helped us? What media helped us? What made it stick? And what made it meaningful? And if we look, we find three general ways that people learn their languages. First, we have our home, within our families, the things that we hear growing up, how our grandparents speak to us, how our friends at school speak to us, exposure in the community. These are the things that shape our early language learning. Then we come to being school age and we take courses in school or universities, or for those who don't have the courses of the language of their choosing in school, they may later take private lessons or classes through organizations. When people decide not to take classes due to budget or time constraints, often they may do solo learning, where they work through textbooks or workbooks or media online, and this is how they set their own pace for learning an additional language. However, when we look at these methods, we have to think, how do these methods look or develop in the context of less spoken languages? So let's look at the drawbacks or the shortcomings here of these traditional methods. At home, people may speak only one language. They may not speak the heritage language or mother tongue of the family in favor of a majority language, which is required to assimilate more into the host society in which the family lives in. Also, the community of speakers may be spread out throughout the diaspora. So even though there are 40 million speakers of Malayalam, for instance, you're not going to find very many in the corner of Northwest Georgia, USA. It's just not going to be around. So this diffusion of the mother tongue community can also lead to a loss in language. Now, for those looking to study lesser spoken languages in schools or universities, we may not have that available because there is not so much of a demand to hold and run these classes. Generally, schools and universities cater to more majority languages or languages that have a lot of soft power like Korean and Japanese. Private tuitions and lessons may be difficult to find simply because there are not people who teach that language if it's so less spoken, or there's not enough demand, or there's not even training for that person to become a teacher teaching their own language in that way. Lastly, for those who are self-studying, I'm sure many of you can relate to not finding good enough resources to self-study a less spoken language. Even though Malayalam is one of the 22 official languages of India, before I started my social media project, there weren't a lot of resources available for self-studiers. And it's not just Malayalam. There are 22 official languages of India, and if you look around, generally Urdu and Hindi are the easiest ones to find resources for, whereas other resources for Bengali or Odia or Kannada are not quite available. Also, some may find that in academia there's a bit of gatekeeping in the fact that languages are studied in a vacuum and not necessarily for those who are casual language learners. So unless you already have a lot of knowledge about language and grammar and syntax and linguistic backgrounds, you might find these resources very difficult to work with and very difficult to understand. So it might stutter or stop someone's learning journey. So why do these problems exist? There's a lot of reasons. First, we look at the lack of funding and investment. Of course, there's supply and demand. So often the cost to create some kind of course outweighs the interest that's involved. Same thing with creating textbooks and workbooks and other types of things. There might be a niche community who can really benefit from having a children's book of Malayalam aimed at English first speakers, but you're not going to find a lot of publishers who want to invest in creating such a text. There can also be seen as a lack of investment, since the language isn't seen as valuable or important to getting work or getting jobs or moving up in society. There is a lack of investment and a lack of capital, which creates this difficulty in promotion and development of quality materials. Also, there's a lack of cultural relevance. If we think about how the language is perceived or how it's promoted within society, that's going to affect the need for it to be studied or the desire for it to be learned. So if there's no cultural relevance, the language will be just seen as a necessary sacrifice in order for the family to move up and get a better job or move across the country or meet the other immediate needs that are there for the people. There's also a lack of currency, social currency. If there's no material being made in this language, for example, if there are not any web series or TV series or comic books or any kind of media being made in this language, then it's just not going to be seen as interesting or relevant. And so lesser spoken languages rely on social currency in order for them to remain valuable in a cultural sense. So here we have this really interesting quote coming from this brilliant article written at CNN, and it's about losing languages and losing culture. So here we have a representative that's working on the Potawatomi language revitalization efforts. And here, this language has only about 10 native speakers still alive. The article focused on how COVID-19 had decimated the elderly community, the Potawatomi tribe. And here we have this quote of this student saying they want to know why it's beneficial, they want to hear it on TV, they want video games. This is the social currency, this is the cultural relevance that is needed in order for a language to preserve and carry on. So again, why does this happen? We have colonization and assimilation. There's been generations of being occupied by speakers of majority languages that have resulted in that language actually becoming the majority language, and the mother tongue or heritage language becomes devalued and lost. And we see that not only in English or the European languages, but we also see this in places where Hindi is a dominant language, Arabic is a dominant language. There are so many communities within communities that have had their local languages die out. Even within Kerala, even though Malayalam is the official language, there are tribal and Adivasi languages that have been dying out due to assimilation. And then we look at this globalized world and what needs to be done in order to succeed. And for many people, that means learning English or Mandarin or another one of the big languages that is used in corporations and in business. And when people internalize that, they feel that, oh, my language is not so important, so it doesn't have the importance to be passed on to the next generation, or there's not enough time or resources to spend on creating resources or developing courses that can help people learn. Also, there is the accessibility aspect of language. A lot of materials for many languages are written for people who have grown up speaking the language or already have access to that language. So it's not approachable for someone who's a complete beginner coming from a different L1 background. And then again, mentioning the issue in academia where languages are studied in a vacuum, and it's not necessarily within the group of people in which the language comes from. And here I'll refer to an article or a quote from this text by Fishman. And it's talking about how the Ainu language, which belongs to the Ainu people of what is now Japan, it's dying out. And it's interesting that even though only 4% of Ainu speak Ainu, they have the languages offered in language centers and universities in Hokkaido. So who are attending these classes and who are learning these languages? So again, would an Ainu person be attending this university and taking the course and affording the course and doing all that's necessary to enroll in such a program? So how would someone from this community who wants to get back in touch with their language be able to access these resources? So why is social media so special? Well, there's a lot of good reasons, but I think the biggest is that social media takes out a lot of the middle people who make the process more complicated. There's no need to go to the Board of Education to request a change in the curriculum. There's no need to get funding from the government in order to produce a language show. There's no need to go through all the red tape that historically we've had to go through in order to bring attention to certain languages or certain cultures. It can just be made from the user itself and uploaded directly into the internet and be enjoyed instantly. Also, it's easy to search, archive, and collaborate. There is power in hashtags. When I first started creating materials for Malayalam, the hashtag Learn Malayalam was only used for about 100 posts in the whole history of Instagram. To give you some insight, hashtag Learn English has about 1.9 million posts, maybe more. And after I started creating content under that hashtag, and then other pages came up and started making content under that hashtag, now it has nearly 5,000 posts, and you can easily search. So anyone who approaches Instagram or YouTube or Twitter, they can find these hashtags easily and be able to archive and collaborate within different users to produce more material. So instead of groups working independently of each other, now there's a network of collective information, which is, again, easier to archive and preserve for future use. And the best thing that I like about social media is that it puts the power of the narrative back into the hands of the people. It creates space for peoples and communities that didn't have space before. There's no space for them in school textbooks. There's no space for them in language classes. There's no space for them in the typical media narrative. But now someone with a mobile phone and an internet connection can say, hey, let me tell you about my people. This is the type of food we eat. This is the type of clothes we wear. This is the history of this. This is the facts about that. And being able to present that without the middle people, as I mentioned earlier, gives a lot of power back into the community and gives a lot of weight to the things that people say. It's easily shared, it's easily spread, and it's easy to educate and make people interested about the topic, because what this does is it creates that social relevance, it creates that soft power, and it builds that momentum for a desire to learn about these things first within the community and then outside the community. Now, when we look at social media, we look at the different ways to help endangered languages. And if we look here on the chart, we look at the methods and we see how effective or ineffective they are in creating some kind of revitalization effort for that language. And if we look here, radio and multimedia are very helpful for all types of endangered languages. And so when we create media, when we create things that have meaning and impact and stories, which is in social media, there's a much better chance of creating revitalization efforts than simply trying to tutor a community or create something that's face-to-face, a short-term kind of course. This is something that has much longer longevity. Here, in relation to preservation of languages, I have a passage from David Crystal and his text, Language Death. And the things that we need to look at is, if we want to give the language power, if we want the speakers of a language to push for their language to continue on, there are these 4 things that stuck out to me. There's a list of several things, but these 4 stuck out to me. Here we have language prestige, how a language is seen in the community. In my own personal example, when I was getting married to my husband, who's from Kerala, we wanted bilingual wedding invitations, Malayalam on one side, English on the other. And let me tell you, there was resistance to that. Not for the English, but for the Malayalam. Why? Because English is seen as a prestige language. If you go to the schools in Kerala, often the English medium ones are in higher demand and tend to have better textbooks, better classrooms, these kinds of things. Why? Because English is seen as the prestige language. So in order for a community to want to preserve and pass on their language and create things that do that, they need to see an elevation in the prestige of it. Next, power. With prestige, there's also power. So in the eyes of the dominant community is the key word here. Those who are in the dominant community need to see and accept and encourage and embolden those who are in these lesser spoken language communities. They need to see that, yes, they do care about my language. They do care about what I believe in. They do care about how I communicate, because it feels very defeatist to try to preserve and work for something that is never going to be recognized in mainstream media or mainstream life or in the public education system or even in the job search. So it takes a community to raise up these less spoken languages, and through social media we can do that. I'm not a native speaker of Malayalam. It's not my mother tongue. It's my husband's mother tongue. But through the work that I've done and the attention that I've gotten for being a Westerner participating in this sphere, I've been able to create a platform where I can platform other creators doing the same thing who are native Malayalam speakers. And this creates a prestige increase, and this creates a power increase. So imagine if there were many people doing these for many languages, creating a platform and then passing the mic. This would make it much more meaningful for these people in these communities who want to have that power and determination to create longevity for their language. And again, being able to write down the language and being able to use electronic technology, this goes into a lot of access issues. For example, we refer back to talks on accessibility and keyboards. Something as simple as having a Malayalam keyboard or a Tamil keyboard is something that can help people participate in the online sphere, in social media, in their own language, and it preserves that. And of course, using technology. If they can use technology with their language, then it's useful, it's meaningful, it's relevant, and so they're going to learn it or preserve it or think of ways to make sure it gets preserved. So again, social media satisfies so many of these different aspects of language revitalization and can assist in achieving these aims that are set to make sure that language revitalization is successful and long-lasting. Now, after talking about that, I do want to show some examples of notable creators and projects that have gotten a lot of attention. These are only a sampling of a few. There are so many wonderful works and content creators out there doing great things. So I just have a couple slides I'd like to show you. First, there's WikiTongues. WikiTongues is a collaborative project of collecting video and audio clips of speakers of all languages all around the world. And what's really wonderful is that even if they're saying we're going to look at one language, for example, here we can talk about French, but they also look for Louisiana French or Quebecois or even smaller, lesser known dialects of French, which is really great because it shows this beautiful spectrum of language and where it is and who speaks it, and it documents it. And I think that documenting is the most important thing social media does. It creates a paper trail, it creates an archive, and that's very powerful for future generations. Also here we have an example of Tlingit language classes being set during the pandemic. I mean, one thing I keep saying is that due to the pandemic, one strange benefit we've had is that we've been able to connect more easily. We see the power that's in meeting online, teaching online, reaching out to communities online. This conference is an example of that. And so here, this is something where face-to-face they may have not had many students or many communities participating, but now online it's grown and the accessibility is high. Also, we have Instagram creators like the Notorious Cree, who, as you see here, I think he has over 1 million followers now. It's incredible the types of work he does. He wears his traditional clothes, he performs his traditional dances, he collaborates with other Indigenous Americans in order to create educational, empowering, strong content that kind of revitalizes our view and our understanding of Indigenous American culture. And then here again is a Blackfoot learning course, which is made for the new generation of learners. And again, it's made in such a way that it looks like something that students would participate in. It looks like a cartoon or a game or something that they would play in English, so why not learn it in Blackfoot? Some other notable projects and creators, we're looking at Zimbabwe here and the Shona language, and there are some pushes to create interface in Shona and seeing the language being used in the internet. And even though Shona is not necessarily a less spoken language, it's definitely less represented in the internet. And so creating spaces for Shona might open the doors for other languages as well to have that accessibility and that access. And then the last thing here is Twitch. A lot of gamers and other content creators use Twitch. And here this article discusses how they use something as simple as a tag to create awareness and extension of languages. So there are people using Twitch in Basque or Gaelic or Welsh. And so these are really interesting ways to kind of bring attention and do things in that language to expose each other. And it rebuilds that community that was once lost. Nowadays, if you're not on the internet, you don't exist. And even though it's something that might disturb many of us, it's absolutely true. If you don't have a Facebook, who are you, right? It doesn't just apply to people. I think it applies to identities and languages and cultures as well. And if you can make it online, if you can put it online and put it there, it shows that yes, you know, we're here, we exist. You can't take this away from us. We create this and we do this. And so the power that the internet has to keep something alive should not be underestimated. And I feel that we should look at it in a positive way. We should look at it in a constructive way, because yes, there's a lot of terrible things on the internet. There's also a lot of great things too. So I'd like to finish with a quote by American author Jonathan Mayberry, and I often use this when I refer to social media. I think of it as a sword, because the sword by itself is not evil. A sword can be used to slay an enemy or release a suffering friend into the darkness. A sword can cut ropes that bind the helpless. A raised sword can be a threat or a symbol of leadership. A sword is good or evil, depending on the intention of whoever holds it. So as we go forward and look into the resources that we create or consume, let's think about how social media can help create something that is viral and shareable and interesting and empowering to the communities that we learn from. Thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I'm looking forward to answering any questions you have after the session. Birne Karnam.